Alright, this is chapter 17, section 2, and it's on classification based on evolutionary relationships. So the key concept here is that modern classification is based on evolutionary relationships. So in the last video, we were talking about the Linnaeus system of classification, and I mentioned how Linnaeus lived in the 1800s, and he didn't have the benefit of DNA and all the other advances in science that we've made since then. So that's what this word modern is referring to, is how we classify organisms today, based on our understanding of biology. So cladistics is classification based on common ancestry. Ancestry. So an ancestor, your great 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 grandmother or grandfather, that would be, you could say that is your ancestor. You hear of ancestry.com. It's where you try to figure out, who were your great grandparents and your great 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 grandparents. Like figuring out your ancestors. It's referring to your family going way back when. And the theory of evolution is that all organisms, if you go far enough back in time, are all related. When I say far enough back in time, we're talking hundreds of millions of years. And so the goal of cladistics is to try to represent that. Try to do our best guess to try and show, that ancestry.com, if you will, type of tree. Who was your great 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 grandpa, 500 million years ago, or how would you say that for a certain turtle or something, trying to, basically another way of trying to put life in neat little boxes, if you will, trying to classify it. Phylogeny is the evolutionary history for a group of species. So phylogeny is just referring to this study where we're trying to get the evolutionary history of a group of species. And we represent this by using these what are called phylogenetic trees. Trees because it looks like a little tree with all these branches. And I'll get into how you read these trees in the coming slides. But how these trees are made up, how we determine them, is based on living species today. It's based on the fossil record. So looking up all the, taking account of all the fossils that we've dug up and identified, and using the molecular data, so using the DNA, your molecular data, so looking at all the base pairs of your A, your T, C, G, and you remember how these different DNA base pairs come together, that determines the different proteins that can be made. And that's kind of like the information or the code that makes you and a frog a frog. Code word nose. Okay, so cladistics, it's a common method to make evolutionary trees. So common method, is again referring to this idea that a scientist living in Houston would use this method to make an evolutionary tree, much like a scientist in China would use it. This idea that we want a common method so that scientists that are working in different parts of the world can kind of be saying the same thing. You can imagine if you had a completely different method, or if there wasn't a common method, then the results that one scientist gets in one part of the world is just gibberish. Doesn't make any sense compared to the results from a different scientist in another part of the world. And these classifications are based on common ancestry, and the species are placed in order that they came from their common ancestor. In other words, it goes forward in time, where as you go back to the left, that's going older in time, and then further to the right is more recent. Okay, so a cladogram, this is a cladogram. A cladogram is that branching tree that I showed you in the second slide. And this is another example of that branching tree. where a clade is referring to a group of species that share a common ancestor. Okay, so a clade is referring to these two plants. They share a common ancestor right here. And this is more recent. And then this is going, so this is like a graph. This would be time right here. Okay, this is your time. So this is back further in time. So this is like, beginning of time, if you will. Where right here, this would be the common ancestor that all of these organisms shared, all these plants. And then once you get right here, this is the common ancestor that this plant, this plant, this plant, and this plant shared. This is the common ancestor that these three plants shared. This is the common ancestor that these two plants shared. Where a clade is referring to a group of species that share a common ancestor. So this is the common ancestor. So this clade is referring to this plant, this plant, this plant, this plant, this plant. This common ancestor. This is the common ancestor for this clade of these four plants. Then going, further on in time, these three plants represent a clade that have this common ancestor. And hopefully you're getting the idea. Where whenever you're talking about a clade, each of these species in that clade have some similar traits to that ancestor. However, each species in here have traits that have changed, meaning that even though all of these plants, all five of these plants belong to the same clade, they all look slightly different or sometimes dramatically different. That means that, as you go along in time, as you get to more and more common ancestors, they're going to have different characteristics. So let me kind of jump on to a more specific graph right here, and this will hopefully kind of start narrowing down what I'm talking about. So again, let me label this time right here. This is sort of like an axis where this is going forward in time. So this is the farthest back in time that this clade shows, where this tan or brownish color, this is what's called the tetrapoda clade. Where tetra means four, it's referring to animals that have four legs. So every single one of these animals in this picture has four legs. Sort of. This snake here, snakes technically have these little tiny baby legs that are essentially non-existent. Birds have wings that count as their two arms. Anyways, four limbs with digits. That is referring to, this is called a node. N-O-D-E. And this is referring to what characteristics all these organisms share. So the four limbs with digits. Then you go further on in time to the next node, where it's the embryo protected by an amniotic fluid. Talking about the amniota clade. So all of these organisms have this thing called an amnion, which is it's basically what surrounds a developing baby and provides that baby with nutrition while it's in the mother's womb. Then you go further on in time, right here, where the reptilia clade, all these organisms here, they all have skull openings behind the eyes. And then you go to the diapsida clade, where they have opening in the side of the skull. Then you go to the final one, the archosauria clade, where they have skull openings in the front of the eye and in the jaw. So again, you're going forward in time, and these are just referring to these physical features that all these organisms share. Okay, and this is kind of referring to this This has the node labeled. So this is the nodes referring to that common ancestor. Common ancestor. Common ancestor. So this is the common ancestor that all of these organisms share. This is the common ancestor that all of the amniota clades share. This is the common ancestor, this node is the common ancestor that all the reptilia clades share. Okay, so really the final thing, and it's how I ended the last one. Um, Before I do, code word chair, just to get those code words in there, it's talking about your molecular evidence. So really all I've been talking about in the previous slides is just physical similarities. It's just identifying these organisms based on how they physically look. And physical similarities may or may not reflect DNA, may or may not reflect how these organisms are related to each other when you compare their DNA sequences. Because the DNA sequences, the molecular data, is ultimately going to be the most accurate determiner of evolution. Whereas physical similarities may or may not be the same as the DNA or the molecular differences. So this before is showing a cladogram where we just classified these different types of worms based on what they look like. Kind of just, they kind of look like this. And this is the after where it's showing, once we take into account the DNA, the molecular data, what this cladogram looks like. And you can see it, it's not completely different necessarily, but it did change, specifically the roundworms and mollusks and segmented worms. But it's not as if like, oh man, these roundworm, this roundworm didn't get replaced by elephants or something ridiculous. They still are all somewhat related, but the molecular data, the DNA bases that these worms share, were slightly different. So it kind of changed up how you would make this cladogram. Code word box. And DNA is given the last word by scientists. DNA is kind of the end-all be-all when it comes to making these cladograms. Doesn't matter if you think that the roundworm, and the flatworm, man, they just look alike and they should be, gosh darn it, they should be in the same clade. Doesn't matter, bro. What the DNA evidence says is that flatworms and mollusks, that's the way to go. They're a clade. Okay, that'll do it.